We've now got the new print action and cancel working for new items, which simply deletes them. And next up, what we want to do is be able to restore any changes that have happened if we don't want to save. So for example, if we go to print only drawings, change it to black and white, type something here, we want to be able to click cancel and get this all reverted. The way we're going to do this is using reflection, and we'll see how that works now. So you might be wondering, what is reflection? Reflection is basically similar to real life. If you think about looking in a mirror and you see a reflection, you're looking at yourself. If you reflect on your life, it's about reflecting about something that's real and that's happened. In code, reflection is basically that. If we wanted to reflect this class, we want to see something about this actual class that's going on, so the properties, the values. JSON serializer is using reflection, so when we serialize this, it's going to use reflection to look into these actual properties at runtime and pull the values in to generate a string. So that's an example of reflection. Anywhere you see sort of type of and then some value, like a print view model, this is also reflection because it wants to determine the type of this at runtime. You don't need to be too concerned about the technicalities of what it is, but that's a quick basic overview. It's when you need to inspect something that's actually running and exists and you want to do something with that data. In this case, we want to look at the string we saved here, the serialized string, and set the properties from that string. So we want to set these properties. For that, we'll first make a function called restore saved state. And what you might think is, firstly, we could have done, say, the opposite of JSON serialize and do var some class equals JSON serializer dot deserialize. And then you can pass in the save state. And you can pass in the type, which in this case is the actions print view model. And that would use reflection to now give us a class of this type. The problem here is this is a new class and we want to set it on the class itself, hence why we need reflection. We could then go, okay, well, what we'll do is just set each property like this. And you could say print drawing range equals some class print drawing range, and you can go through like this and set every property. This is perfectly valid, but the problem you're going to have with this is this now becomes unique to this class. And let's say I decide, oh, we've got another property we're going to add in here. It's called ID2. And now you've got to remember to go back and edit this class. So then you'd have to add ID2 here, and it's now a requirement that you're going to easily forget. The other issue is this is also specific to this class no matter what, even if you didn't change it. So when we want to do it on the other view models, you're going to have to retype all this, and you're going to have a load of classes where you're restoring these values. And to be honest, that's what a lot of active developed apps currently do. They don't necessarily use reflection. This is kind of an old school way of doing it. But what we want to do is similar to what this deserialize does, but into the class itself. So into this, we want to be able to set these properties by deserializing ourselves. It's nowhere near as hard as you might think. We're just going to use some really basic reflection. We'll first deserialize, just like we did, because we do actually want to use the deserialize of the save state to get the properties that we want to save. And this we can make generic after. So we will use a generic class afterwards, or put this in a base class to be able to deserialize this by any type, not just the specific one. And now what we want to do is same as what we were trying to do, setting the properties, but instead we want to do it automatically with reflection. We don't want to have to type all these classes. For that, we want to loop each property in the class. And what we're going to do here is say you don't get the property, you get something called property info. This is a reflection class. You can see IntelliSense has literally figured it all out for us almost. The only thing is it's nothing to do with save state, it's the type we're in. And what it's going to do is get type, it's going to get the type of this class. And it's important to use this because it needs the actual runtime type. Then after that, it's going to call get properties. So what this is going to do is return anywhere there's a property. So this isn't a property, this is a private field, but the property it generates with the public string some property. This is what's known as a property when you have a getter and setter, or even just a getter. So what we want to do is get the type of this class, loop through all the properties. And if we wanted to just see that in action first, we can put a breakpoint here. And we need to bind to this. So we need to do something with this restore save state in order to actually perform that action. If we go to the page view model and scroll down, we have the option here to cancel. And we had the code here for if it was a new item. And now we just want another one. If it isn't a new item, then we'd want the selected print list item dot restore save state. So that's now hooked up. And when we run the code, we can click cancel and see what the properties are. So with this running, if we now go into here, just change anything, it doesn't matter, click cancel. And now you can see we can look through each one. Down here, you can see the property info. If we expand, has the name. So there's drawing exclusion list title, which is a property. Press F5, then you have has changed, ID, job name, selected, description. So you can see this is now looping the class's properties. So that's the first step. The next step is we need to fetch the value of them properties. So to do the value fetching, we can do the new value equals, and then you can see the IntelliSense again. You can call the property info and .get value, and now you pass in, because if you bear in mind at the minute, we haven't told it anything about this class. This is just a reflection of the class type. So it knows nothing about our current runtime class that's storing values. That's where passing this in here uses the reflection to now read the property from the class itself. So this should be the selected print list items values now being pulled in. If we put a breakpoint here, let's just inspect that again. Go to actions, and in here we'll type in, say, this is a job title, click cancel, and then down here, if we just look for when the name is job name, there we go, scroll up, and you can see this as a job title. So now we've managed to pull in the values that we want, and all we need to do now is set the values on this class as well from the save state. And because we don't want to get the value off this current class, we want to pull it from the save state, we can use the same trick here now. We're now going to pass in the deserialized version. And if we run that, you'll see now instead of pulling this as a job title, we should pull what the original save state was. So in this case, if we say this is a job title, click cancel, flick through here until name is job name. And now if we look up, you can see it says print only drawings because it's pulled it in from this save state class, which obviously has the original values. So you can see this is now the, I'd say, not new value, original value. So we want to pull the saved value and finally restore it to this class. So to set the info, it's exactly the same. And you can see IntelliSense has done it all for us. And it's done property info.setValue, and this time it's on this class. So remember, we used to get the value from this class, now we're getting it from the save state. But then to set the value, we're setting it on this class, and we're passing in the value that was stored in the save state. If we run this, let's see what happens. Go to actions, change this to anything, click cancel. And we have an issue at the minute. Property method not found. And what method is it trying to find? Set value. So what it's trying to do here, I'm guessing, is it's trying to set a value on a property that isn't writable. So effectively a property that is just a getter, which would be something like this. So drawing exclusion title list, there's no way to set this because it's a getter only. So we need to update the for each loop, and we can just do it within here. In fact, we can't. We'll have to do it inside of a loop here. So what we'll do is, if the property info IntelliSense is taking control there, can write, then we can proceed. Or we could do the inverse logic, whereas if you can't write, then you continue. So only set setters, not get only properties. That should get us around that issue. So now if we go into here, do this, click cancel, we can see it's now managed to go through, and it's set job ID to 1. Going to set the title, drawing, so let's just let that run. And that didn't quite work because now everything's blank. Oh no, it isn't, it's just deselected it. So if we click here, change something, click cancel, and reselect, you can see it's restored. So we've lost the selection, but that will be because we have an isSelected here, and this is getting overridden. You can see we have the property JSON_ignore on. So anywhere there's a JSON_ignore on the serializer, we can do it on the deserializer as well. So in our own class, we can kind of honor that property and ignore anywhere there's a JSON_ignore. So we can say here, ignore any properties that have a JSON_ignore flag, or attribute as it's officially called. And for that, we can do if propertyinfo.get custom attributes, and we want a type of the JSON_ignore attribute. We don't want the inherited values, so we'll leave that as false. And then this will return a list of them because you can have multiple. So we just care about the first one really. So get length of the first one. And if that is 0, which ultimately means there is no property, we can continue. In fact, no, we want to say if the property is greater than 0, we want to continue because we're doing negative logic. So this will say if there's a custom attribute of JSON_ignore, ultimately that's what that's saying, then we also ignore it. That should mean we won't restore anywhere where we've got JSON_ignore. So we won't restore isSelected. And now hopefully we'll find that the selection will stay. And there we go. So you can see now you can change everything, click cancel, and it all restores. One thing you will notice though is notice down here, the printer selection. You click cancel, we're losing the selection. So there's something wrong now after we've restored with these selection lists. If we take a look at this class and we scroll down, you can see here is the printer profile that's going missing. And I think the problem here is ultimately we've got a view model storing another view model, which is not necessarily wrong or bad. But what we're going to have is when we restore from JSON and it pulls in and recreates a new view model and then updates this property, our code, the way it works in here, where we make profiles up. And if you remember when we did this, the workaround was to store a reference to the view model, because as soon as it's a new instance, we were having issues with selection. So that's really indicating we're still doing something wrong. I'd say the problem we have here is we shouldn't really store the full view model. I think instead what we should store is just the ID to the view model, considering that the list is pulled in the top level, and we have specific profiles here and they have IDs, and we don't want a double reference containing double information either. This will also help us when we come to save the database, because we're also then not committing duplicate entries in Entity Framework, which will also cause headaches. So now let's fix this issue. Let's change this from the printer profile to a printer profile ID and make this a blank string. And then if we go to the print view, we should find down here somewhere selected item. Here we go. So now this needs updating. Let's now fix this. Instead of going on the selected print item, we can't really bind to selected item now because we don't want to keep an instance of the class inside of printer profiles. So what that means is we're going to have to use instead a selected value. And what this will allow us to do is first we can say selected value binding. And you'll see this is going to automatically reference the single instance of item source. So it's going to reference a single printer profiles item. And this is telling us what property on the value do we want to bind to. So out of this entire class now, because we're not binding to the entire class, which property on the actions printer profile view model, so on this class, which of these properties now do we want to class as the key to the selection? So the key to which item is going to get selected or updated. And for that, we'll obviously use the ID. So what we want to do is set that to ID. And then now for the actual binding to something. So in this case, we want to bind it to our new ID property. We'll do a selected value, and the binding is to the selected print list item dot print profile ID. So now we're not linking to a full view model and we're binding to just a string. We're still going inside of this class, which I don't fully like, and it's something we might tackle in the future. We might want to move the selected print profile ID to the top, which is quite easy to do. We can just put the property in here. And as well as having the selected print item, we could bind to an ID. So you could have, say, a private string selected print item ID, and we can bind to this, and then we could have a print view model that doesn't have selected. So let's just take it one step at a time first and get this new binding working. And then if we compile that, you'll see we've got a bunch of issues at the minute now because we've removed the printer profile from inside of here. This is where we want to set the printer profile ID. So we can simply change that now from printer profile ID. And we'll just set the default to, let's say, 1 for this one. We'll do 2 for the next one. So we're going to see not 0, but 1. So the second item, third item, and then the fourth item, just for a change to see it working. We've got any more errors? One more. New item, same thing. We'll set the ID on a new item to 0, so the first item. And all this would come from the database. Typically, this wouldn't be obviously set here manually. This would be part of this database pull. That's now built successfully. And let's see if that works. You can see now 1, 2, and 3. So the binding's working. And if we create a new item 0. The question is now, if we change this to there and click cancel, you can see now that works. So that fixes the issue with binding, and it allows the cancel to properly restore everything. There we go. I think also, if I remember rightly, we didn't put a new line on this. Yes, let's just quickly fix that text box while we're there. I think I saw that quite a few videos ago and completely forgot about it. So that would be this text box here, and we want accept return to true. So we can actually type new lines. While we're here, let's probably try to do the same thing for the selected print list item, because we're doing a similar thing. We have the selected print list item as a duplicate of an item that's already inside the print list. It's kind of a doubling up again of instances, and this is going to cause us issues in the future as well. So instead, let's change that to a string selected print list item ID, just in the same fashion, and blank this one out. This is also an old printer profile getter and setter. I think this is maybe just when I was showing you how to do MVVM. Not sure why we still got that in there. Let me just be updated to that. And do we even use that actually? No, we don't. So we obviously need this selected print list item now, but we weren't even using this selected printer profile item, so that can just literally go. But what we do need is to restore this selected print list item. So for that, we'll just have a public getter again. This will be an actions print view model, and it's nullable because it's not always selected. It'll be the selected print list item, and it's going to be the selected, or in this case, the print list dot first door default, where the ID equals the selected print list item ID. I think that's correct. Yep, that now builds. And what we're going to have to do is also update the UI in a similar fashion. So we're going to have to go to here. So again, this binding, which was originally binding to the selected print list item, this needs to change again to the selected value binding, which will be the ID, just the same, and the selected value will now bind to the selected print list item ID. And this is how I was mentioning we probably want the selected printer profile list doing at some point. But for now, that's fine there. We also won't need this anymore, this binding to the is selected. And that's because this was to fix a workaround when we were binding to the class and we needed to reset the is selected inside of the view model that was part of this binding. So now we're not binding to a view model, we don't need to set the inner is selected. So this can just get deleted, which cleans that up a bit as well. And I think if we've done that right, and this should hopefully still work, we've lost the selection on startup. And no, nothing at all is working yet. So we're missing something else at the minute. Part of the issue might be this binding to is selected, which I believe is in the print view list here. So let's just delete that because the selected on this isn't really bound to the view model anymore. And let's just change this to a parent binding of the list. What are we in list box? So list box item dot is selected. So we'll just select on the visual tree of whether it's selected or not. And let's just see if that changes anything. Oh, now we have issues with selection here. So maybe this is going to highlight where the issue is. So this, because the properties aren't inside here now, instead we have the selected print list item ID. We want to set that in order to make the selection. And we can set it based on the first property. This one is where we add a new item and we set it to selected this way. And instead, what we can now do is set it here instead. So select item, and again, just bind to the ID and set it to the new item ID. And then I think there's one other issue on the deleted. And again, we want the ID, and we just then want to set the selected print list item ID. So that's the binding now fixed in the back end as well. So instead of setting view models inside the view model, we're now setting just the ID. So does that now work? Yes and no. The selections worked, but I've definitely done something majorly wrong here because nothing is showing. So we fixed the selection side and we've just lost all binding here. So I've obviously got a typo or something pretty obvious somewhere where I've just completely bound to the wrong thing, I think. And I don't think the bindings are wrong. They don't look wrong. We are definitely binding to the ID and the selected print list ID, but this actual item, this item, yeah, that must update. We haven't set. Because we've now got a getter, we need to tell the UI when the getter should update, and that's every time this ID updates. So we forgot to put the notify property changed for in here. Name of the selected print list item. Otherwise, it's never going to get notified of when to refetch this item. So hopefully that's going to fix the last issue. We go into here. There we go. That's looking better now, almost. Now we just have one issue where, strangely, the first item is off. If we go out and in, you can see straight away the first item is saying that something's changed, and it's because it's not default selecting this first item. So everything else is working. You tab in and out. These are all the same. The cancel works. But literally the first item in the list is starting off as a random value. So if it's the first item, it's got to be something to do with this fetch list. And I'm wondering whether it's going to be as simple as we are updating the printed or the selected print item list, which then will try and set the first selected item, but we haven't yet even made or bound to the printer profile, so it can't make a selection, if that makes sense. So if you make a new print list and the UI updates, and then it tries to make this first item that it's now made select something from this printer list, but the printer list doesn't yet exist because we haven't actually set it. So let's just try and move the printer list above the print list. So the printer profile list can sit above here. Maybe it's as simple as that. Now we go in. Yes, there we go. So now it's working. So that must mean the UI in some way keeps track of this order of precedence as well. So even though this is in one call and on one thread, and you wouldn't expect any of the binding to happen until the call is finished, it must also listen out and honor the order in which these things are getting set inside of this thread, which is pretty interesting. But all in all now, we should have a cancel function, so we can change things and then click cancel and restore them back to what they were. So that's it for this one, guys. I'll catch you in the next.